We are up and running. It's a beautiful day here in the Midwest, nice and cool, and there is definitely a strong sense of autumn in the air. The pumpkins are getting blushed in the fields. So, how are you there, Barret and Devan? Are you guys enjoying this cornucopia type of season?
I am. I'm rather a corny kind of guy, and actually, the autumn comment reminded me of the Ottoman Empire, which I don't know if that's connected at all to the time of Jesus, but it sounds appropriate. So,
Yeah, well, I think the Ottomans of the world would unite behind that. So you can
they were
put your
always
feet
at
put your
war with
feet up and kick back.
people, right? They were always at war with the spring people.
Hmm.
Hey guys. I wanted to tell everybody in ACIM Gather, as we're here today as well, that we are here discussing a movie as we've been gathering together. And today's movie discussion is The Last Temptation of Christ. So what was your overall opinion about it?
Well, for me, my first thought, I remember seeing it when it first came out, and I was very mystified with it and enchanted with it. But now, 20 years later, I can see where there probably was inspiration from A Course in Miracles in the genesis of the movie, because the Course was definitely being handed around, especially in that community on the West Coast. And, the timing is so perfect because the Course came into being in the early 70s, and this movie came into being in the late 80s. So I think that there was some pollination going on there. And I do love the movie. I think it's something that everybody who's into A Course in Miracles should go ahead and pick up and either rent it or buy it and give it a spin more than once, because there's a lot of content in here that definitely highlights A Course in Miracles. And at the same time, you can understand why the entire Catholic Church and most of the Protestant churches had a complete meltdown. I think this was banned, and I think there was talk of excommunication for some of the people involved in it. But nonetheless, it is a Course in Miracles movie if there ever was one.
Well, I just looked up exactly when the book was written, and it was first published in 1955. So that's before any A Course in Miracles came into fruition. But I definitely do not doubt that it's the same idea and the same teaching as the same questioning of this Father Church idea, and really getting into doing the same thing as he was doing in the movie, where he was really what's the word, inflaming the ego or Satan within the beings around it. And it was pretty intense to see happening, and it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. I had never seen the movie before, and I know since we're on ACIM Gather, we're kind of in multiple formats at the same time. I'm just going to introduce myself. This is Barret Hadeen. Also, obviously in the room is Reverend Devan Byrne, and then Chris Anderson, One Feather. So it's the three of us joining in this conversation. Just for those who are just joining us, hearing our voices, you kind of have a feel for who's in the crew. And yeah, I thought it was interesting. I wouldn't say it was my favorite movie, but I thought that there were some real revealing parts. The central character in this is Jesus, but he's a very conflicted Jesus who he's not doing all the same things that he did in the Bible. There's a pretty strong overlap and parallel, but it's also other things involved as well. Like the movie opens and he's actually creating the crosses that his fellow Jews are being hung on, and actually helping in the crucifixion. And I don't know, I mean, obviously, it's emphasizing the human side of Jesus, I guess, a lot, and um, I don't know, I just didn't click with that at all.
Well, I think that definitely will raise some hackles on most people's back because we are really invested in this biblical image of Jesus. But at the same time, there were definitely other variations there. I know that Mary Magdalene was portrayed as the woman who was a prostitute. And from the writings of Josephus and some other writings, we know that was not, in fact, true. So historically, there was definitely license taken in some of the interpretations, or in actually a lot of the interpretations. But the one central thing that comes through early on in the movie is Jesus has that recognition that I am God, or that God is me, more appropriately put into perspective, because he has that early confrontation with the Christ within him, and that really is the background of the story, of the journey of the story, is to arrive at a place where we recognize there is no duality. Duality is a complete illusion, and even the paradox around duality is an illusion. So I thought it brilliantly illuminated that, because he was, every time he would utter that, he would make that strong statement and everybody would scream blasphemy. And that's really what happens with the Course in Miracles. Once we arrive at that understanding, if we go out and stand on a mountaintop and proclaim it, people are going to tell us that we're being blasphemous. So it's very lucid. It's very succinct in the way the story is presented.
I very much enjoy the way it was portrayed as more of taking Jesus down from being idolized and instead making it personal. And I feel like it made it into this human struggle that we all really go through, and it's more about finding the Christ within and finding that God within than it is about, the reason most churches don't like it is because it's about King of Kings, worship, and you be the minions and the slaves, and give us all your money, in that hierarchy. And so this brings it back to the individual, into the people, and it makes it more identifiable as far as with my story. And that's, just to completely relate with that, lack of a better word, shredding in the war and inside my mind, that's saying one thing and wanting another, and going back and forth, and it really is, it gets personal when you watch it with open eyes of truly relating with it.
Yeah, and I feel like watching the movie from the perspective of a metaphor, that Jesus, his experience was that of having temptations and having pains and doubts and fears. I don't doubt that at all. And I really believe that, especially in the earlier part of Jesus's life, he had that. He had issues to overcome, otherwise he wouldn't have manifested here, right? So when I look at the movie through that lens, I probably enjoy it more. And there were even parts of the movie, like fairly early on, after he starts gathering his followers, he does really go into this message of love. I mean, and he says over and over again that love is the answer. He had this one talk, again, in maybe the first half of the movie somewhere, where he's talking with Judas, and basically Judas is saying, we need to take care of the problem here first. We need to take care of the Romans before we can address the spirit. And his message is, no, until we remove the poison of the ego from within us, then every action you take here is going to result in more poison. And I thought that was a beautiful message that is definitely in sync with the message of A Course in Miracles, and a really good reminder for all of us, especially as we're here in a time of change. All of the issues around white supremacy and other issues around immigration and everything that's happening in our world. there's a lot of desire to fight in people that I'm seeing, and that is just very present. And again, nothing right or wrong about the fighting, but if we cannot engage with people with an energy of love and kindness, then all of our efforts are in vain. And I think remembering that as we go forward is really key. And I think that was one of the really great messages that I did get from the movie.
Yeah, the movie was ripe with a lot of Course in Miracles concepts and imagery. And, back in the 50s, when the actual novel itself was written, like you said, Devan, it was at a kind of a bubble in what was going on in the writing community. And J.D. Salinger, who is known for his Catcher in the Rye, also wrote a collection of short stories called 9 Stories, and one of them is the story Teddy, and that is just pure Course in Miracles, and that was written in the 50s. So, Salinger was doing stuff. The writer of this novel, Nikos, well, wherever you want to go with that last name, he is very Greek. But at any rate, there was this awakening that was going on post World War II, and but by the time it came into review to become a movie was in the 80s, and by then there was definitely a Course in Miracles community in its fledgling state, on the 2 coasts, largely the East Coast and West Coast. So you can really see, how spirit, how higher consciousness is riding this bubble of awakening and pulling all these elements together to support A Course in Miracles. And the thing I liked about the movie, it was filmed in Morocco, which actually was an act of genius, because Morocco has a lot of areas that are pure desert or semi-desert and very barren. And so the early parts of the movie, you are kind of thrown off your focus. If they'd filmed it in Jerusalem and along the Galilee, it would have been an entirely different environment. It would have been probably graphically more accurate. But by filming it in this very austere environment, it almost becomes like a stage play. And that causes you to look at the characters more rather than the background and the peripheral elements. And, it's very rich in context. The soundtrack, the music is awesome. It's very accurate for the era. The clothing, the dress is very accurate, but the background is very stark. So you're really seeing these characters pop into your face, and you're compelled to hear what they're saying. You're compelled to listen to the dialogue, and that's really, I thought, was one of the points of genius within the film itself.
Yeah, and I think that, that it really was well acted too. I mean, like, it was a well done movie. Again, I didn't even realize until I watched the credits that was David Bowie. I was like, oh, that's who that was. But Harvey Keitel was Judas. He was awesome in his role. And I don't know why I'm blanking on the lead's name, but that was probably the best I've ever seen him in a performance in any film. So yeah, I think altogether it really was well done, and I think for basically sort of one of the purposes of the movie felt to me like sort of cracking through the sort of facade of mainstream Christianity and presenting alternative ideas. And I think if that was its purpose, it definitely accomplished it. I think it sort of it gave us a very human Jesus. Which again, it was very different than the one that the churches have been giving us. And I think, like you said, it was a main reason why the churches protested and against it and boycotted the film when it came out in the 80s. I mean, heaven forbid we have Jesus with a boner. Like, oh my God, that can't be. So.
Well, and even the idea of Jesus making decisions. I mean, in a large degree, Jesus was in a state of surrender, and large parts of the movie. So, and that's what the Holy Spirit is all about, is our stopping our inclination to make decisions on our own and to rely on, the Father within to give us the direction. And I thought it was beautifully illustrated when he was saying, I don't know what I'm going to say. I just have to stand up and open my mouth, and boom, that connection is made, and I am the voice of that higher force. So, yeah, it definitely had some high points there that churchy people are not real happy about once they start to enter into that movie.
Yeah, before I first saw it, someone was telling me about the book. They was like, well, the book portrays it a lot better, of course, like any movie. Even though they made it an extended length of a film, it still left out a bunch. And that part when he went to the monastery, which was just like mud huts out on a mountain somewhere, he was, someone was telling, well, he kept saying that I'm having this conflict, like I keep thinking I'm Christ, and yet I keep thinking I'm a sinner and I need to stop, and he went through that purification process, and it was actually in the book said that the snakes came out of his feet, and one of them, and it went into a hole, and then he came out of it, and he, with the monk, he's like, you're purified. And he's like, yes, I'm purified. So now who are you? He's like, now I am Christ. Like you would think that it was the Christ blasphemy that escaped purity, his purification was to get rid of blasphemy as they intended, but instead the blasphemy was thinking he was something other than Christ.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing that shows up in a couple of scenes in the movie is the idea of taking the snake, which is part of the Old Testament, the journey out of heaven, when the snake offers the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, duality. So in this particular instance, the fruit is presented as an apple, which is pretty much common accepted interpretation of the fruit. And we see the apple tree and him eating the apple on a couple of different occasions. And at the final confrontation, he bites into the apple when he's out in the desert, and the blood comes out of the apple, and then he realizes, oh, I'm biting into death. I'm biting into this physical, corporeal world. So he jumps out of his circle and takes his axe and chops down the apple tree. I mean, that's pretty strong symbolism and pretty profound expression of how we do have to be constantly alert as to what we're ingesting, what fruit we are eating.
Yeah, I really like that scene where he went and kind of drew the circle and basically said, I'm not coming out of the circle, God, you have to come in here. It reminded me a lot of the story of Buddha sitting under the Bodhisattva tree, or whatever the name of that tree was, where he just sat for many, many days, and all of his all of his fears, all of his doubts, all of the ways his inner demon basically was showing up, with women, with money, with his fame, whatever his sort of temptations were, all presented themselves to him. And similarly in this movie, Jesus had a lot of temptations coming to him. So I think it's fascinating, and it's no coincidence that both of the two major players in our world that kind of have their stories of awakening, they have this going into wilderness and sitting and watching all of their inner stuff surface, and eventually saying no to all of it. So yeah, I think that is sort of like the similarity of all of our paths, that we have to go through all of our stuff in order to emerge into that Christ, as Devan was just saying.
Yeah, I really enjoy that scene. And in fact, it said, they really don't know, but it said the actual time under the tree of with the Buddha was about 40 days and 40 nights as well. But we really don't know. He didn't keep track of it. He's out doing escaping or trying to escape for many, many years. But I really enjoy that as well. As I like how the snake was like, yeah, come on, you can have a woman, have a family, just like Adam. You don't want to be alone. And I gave him this. And it's funny that he kind of comes to the conclusion that Satan is everywhere around you, and it is God within you. And it's while it's true, I mean, it makes sense. It's still trying to make sense out of using all these separate terms and separate ideas and everything. That I would say that, with the definition and the physical separation idea projected outwards, it is all ego. It is this idea. But when you do find that Christ or God within you, then it's I'm getting cut off. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great. I don't know if ACAM Gather can hear you, but I can hear you.
Got a delay now.
Yeah, well, we're doing good on our end.
Yeah. Sorry.
So
Technical issues. Let me reset something here real quick. Every now and then it just has an issue like this.
while you're resetting things, another observation I had that was, I thought, a significant part of the movie was that when we are introduced to Mary Magdalene in her boudoir, there are, a dozen men waiting for access to her bed. And finally, at the end of the day, after she services all of these guys, Jesus comes in, and they have a confrontation to a certain degree, and she's receptive to him, and he denies her, and she makes a very interesting statement. She says, "Go, leave. You're still a virgin." And I thought that was a very interesting aspect of the movie and of the portrayal of Jesus, was that, here he was, obviously in his 30s, still a virgin, and deciding to maintain that that state of denial of, one of the strongest tugs into the realm of the flesh. So whether or not, you see that as having any kind of significance, in my mind, I thought it was very telling that he had been denying himself on a lot of different levels over and over again on this quest to try and actually enter into this intimate relationship with God. And I obviously I wouldn't say that is a necessary component, but I think that was brought into the spotlight for a reason. And we were given the idea that Jesus not only rejected the idea before the crucifixion of having an intimate relationship with Mary Magdalene. I think that, that kind of also highlights the Da Vinci Code, with its whole foundation built on the idea that Jesus was here to establish a genealogy, to establish a race of his own offspring. So it's interesting how these two different movies, if you look at the Da Vinci Code in comparison to The Last Temptation, they go in entirely different directions. And I think The Last Temptation is one that stays truer to the vision that Jesus was trying to hold on to in his journey from, the cradle to the cross.
Yeah, and I would say my take on it is, is more alignment with the teachings of Gary Renard around his relationship with Mary Magdalene. She was not a prostitute. as portrayed in this movie. I do think she was married to Jesus, as was in the Da Vinci Code, but I also don't think they actually had any children. So there wasn't really a bloodline offspring. And again, in Gary's teachings, Mary is presented to us as enlightened as Jesus, and really his equal, which I think is true as well. But to touch on your other point about the denial piece, in this movie, Jesus is presented as denying himself, sex. And in the stories about Buddha, again, I'm not terribly versed, but I read a few of them. They talk about Buddha basically doing the path of austerity, doing the path of denial of food, sleeping on a bed of nails, again, whether he literally did that or not, but those sorts of things, so that when he awoke to his higher self, his followers basically said, oh, well, you got that through doing it like this. So didn't sorry, I had a ding on my end. His followers said to him, oh, you got it through doing this, maybe we should do that too. And him responding, no, that is not what I advocate. So even though he had taken the path of austerity, that he basically then talked about following the middle way, following that middle path where you're not denying, but you're also not luxuriating in the things of this world, that ultimately they become neutral, which is really the teaching of the Course. A Course in Miracles teaches us there is no inherent good or bad in this world. It is simply neutral, and it can be used for our awakening, or it can be used to keep us asleep. And which one we're using it for is always the choice that we're making.
Yeah, as far as the specifics and how it actually happened, it's funny that we're just like choosing which universe to choose from. It's interesting because as far as I see it, there was several different stories, and not just stories of what happened, but actually they all happened, and Mary was as much of every version of Mary that could ever be, as well as there was a Jesus as far as every version of a Jesus that there could be. But that gets into a whole nother complication of things. But in other words, I wouldn't deny anyone of how it was or seemed to be, but it is a tapping into one or a multitude of variations of these options of stories and which happened. And as far as which one I want to see, it comes back to that neutral thing. And what I want to see, is that purity and that pure essence of love. So then my option of the universe is only an indicator of what I'm choosing to see within myself. And I think this movie is portraying that in a way that even on that last temptation, he still really takes almost that first temptation that the serpent offered, of having a family and having children. And it's beautiful. And as I've often said, and I think I've said it to you too as well, that I feel like I'm going through the last temptation of Christ. After my death experience, I did have the option of coming back to the world, and the option I took was feeling resentment or resenting the fact that I didn't have a family yet, and I came back and literally started a family as soon as I was able. And so I'm going through that, and I'm just speaking if anyone is willing to hear or ready to hear, and doing whatever I'm here to do. And something that little angel say, if it was Lucifer or not, it doesn't really matter. It's it's all God, it's all ego, it's all Lucifer, it's all the same thing. It's just what am I willing to see? And how it was saying, he doesn't need to suffer on the cross anymore. Go down and save him, and let him die in a dream instead, happy with his family. And then getting more into the movie, but it's just a beautiful, I feel like, portrayal of of my life, like, and not to say only this one.
Right. And the thing that pops up around Mary is that at one point in the movie, toward the end of the movie, there is a very strong statement that is made that there is only one Mary. There may be, Mary wearing many faces, but there is only one Mary. And that comes back to the idea that Gary Renard had about Mary, which is, and you see it in the two serpents in the movie, which is not only visually two different physical serpents, but also it's portrayed on the walls and paintings and stuff like that. And it is that duality that exists in this realm. So we see Mary Magdalene and Jesus as examples of that first step in the separation, which is, the division within self to masculine and feminine. So all of the content of the movie really remarkably drives us in the direction of stepping out of that idea of any kind of separation on any level of life, and even within that, the illusions that are presented to us from the snake and from the apple is, tracing it back to the root. It's that one core idea that created all of this, which is, that one mad instant of a thought about separation created this profoundly complex dream. And there's no reason to fight the dream. We're not here to conquer the dream. What we're supposed to be doing is riding our surfboards through the dream. And, every once in a while we'll catch a good wave and make a little significant progress. But ultimately, it's a gentle awakening. It's not a crucifixion. And if we believe that what is being removed from our lives in the context of our physical experiences, our mortal experiences, then we feel like we are being crucified. So, the journey is a gentle journey unless you are creating chaos, which causes you pain.
Yeah, and in a way, we all have our nails, right, and our hammers. It reminds me of that joke that I've heard a few people say, where Jesus walks into a hotel and he lays some nails on the counter, and he says to the guy, "Can you put me up for the night?"
Oh, that's dreadfully humorous in its own perverse way.
But, we all have that, right? We're all carrying around our nails, we're all carrying around our hammer, and we're all asking people to hang us on the cross because we want to be the martyr, right? It's the work that we all have is to see the ways we're doing that. And most of us would maybe even deny that we're being the martyr in our life. But if we're willing to look or take the blinders off, usually we can see at least one and probably several areas, or maybe all the areas in our life where we do this in some way. And the more honest we are with ourselves, the more we actually start putting the nails down, right? The more that we can really come from love in our interactions rather than judgment, and the more that our life becomes that happy dream that Jesus is always saying is our goal on the Course. So, I like to say that the Course is really about radical self-honesty. And it's not always pleasant to be radically self-honest, but it is the path to peace. And it's a path worth walking, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's very true. And another part of the movie that I really enjoyed was Harry Dean Stanton shows up as the Apostle Paul, who early on he's Saul, and he's on his way to Damascus, and he's out there chasing down the followers of Jesus. But then after the transformation, he comes back and he actually confronts Jesus and says, what the hell are you doing here? You're walking away from, your mission, your job. And I thought that was kind of a cool way to put Paul into the storyline, because normally you wouldn't see him in context to what was going on there, because he came into the picture after the crucifixion. And it was one of Harry Dean Stanton's best roles, you know, that and his role in with the kid there in the flying car. But anyway, Harry Dean Stanton is an excellent portrayal of the Apostle Paul, and you know, you'll get a kick out of when he steps on the stage, because he's very powerful in that role.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just as a film, it was moving, and it was interesting. And again, I think when you look at it through the lens of sort of busting the myths of Christianity, it definitely does that. It sort of takes a sledgehammer to the stereotypical story of what Jesus's life was, and sort of puts the pieces back together in all kinds of different ways. So I think if people are sort of worshiping that story, you know, what we call the dogma of Christianity, I think that's a good purpose. You know, it's a good purpose to let that story go, because it doesn't really serve anyone in truth. So
it does plant a seed. You know, if someone's willing to make it through, or even partially through, I think it starts off, you know, are you gonna make it 5 minutes into this? And then you have some willingness to hear something different, a little bit harder to understand, a little more questionable. But I would definitely relate with the idea that it's more about me, you know, and then this image of really truly you know, a master of divinity and of the mysticism, and as Jesus is in my mind. And this, so as far as that's all I got. I forget what I was going to say.
So you're totally spaced out on that one. That's kind of fun. At the very end of the movie, again, I thought that it was a very clever use of a statement from the Bible, because in the 9th hour of the crucifixion, we were told that Jesus said, you know, it is accomplished, it is completed, it is over. And so in this instance, when Jesus is on the cross and he utters those words, it is accomplished, there is a whole different level of understanding that comes from that statement. What he meant was, it is accomplished. I have let go of the mortal Jesus. I have fully become the Christ, you know, and then I'm going to hang out with you guys in a couple of days here, and eventually ascend a second time. But I thought that was a beautiful way to use a statement from the Bible that could be very, very disenchanting, very, you know, very much the role of I give up, you know, it's all over. But taking it in that different direction, it is, you know, I have overcome death. He said that as he allowed the body to go through the process of dying. So again, we get some very strong Course in Miracles imagery and thought that the Bible just, you know, the New Testament version just simply doesn't portray to us.
yeah, and I like that too. I like that it's such a reinterpretation of these standard stories, right? I mean, a lot of us have kind of heard them over and over again our whole lives. So to be exposed to different ways of seeing, I think, is a real benefit. And you know, I really believe that Jesus wouldn't have cared. You know, we're talking about the different versions of his story. Like, this movie is one, Gary Renard's version is one, the Christian version is one. I don't think Jesus himself really cares, you know, because you know, it was just a story, right? I mean, it's sort of like if the three of us sort of woke up and we had dreams that had the same characters in them, but they were doing different things, and we were sitting at the breakfast table arguing about whose dream was right, you know. It's like, okay, well, you know, it might be kind of pointless.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's more about what is it teaching and how's the Spirit using it, than it is about the specifics about what occurred and what didn't occur. And even this idea that, as Dan says, brings up in the room here, that the tree wasn't real, and talking about the knowledge of good and evil, that it, it's just proverbial. And it, as much as him in the desert, none of that was real. Like, nothing occurring was real. And it was all just pretty much a projection of his mind. And that's just kind of the beginning of the whole thing, that even when he's going into that last temptation of having a family, and he's hearing was it Paul or something preaching about Jesus died for our sins, and he's like, no, I didn't do that, and that whole thing, and the whole thing is just starting to get into this whole, how much of my life really is not real. And we're all going to live saying that our past was a certain way, and people that we interacted are going to say, no, your past was this way, just like mine was. And we're going to talk about the same stories that we interacted with our family and friends as completely different occurrences happening. And, it's not really it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever about the specifics, as long as it's teaching us what we really need to learn, and that is the recognition and awakening of that Christ itself. And so the Spirit speaks, within all of us, teaching us, trying to get us through to that message of recognition, and using all these movies, hoping that, that seed does grow and lands on that rich soil and becomes enough to feed nations, as far as quite literally, you're not just a little person, but you're quite literally the entire universe, and it's everything that could possibly exist in the perspective of a little person. And it's pretty profound if you really, or I should say, when you really get into it.
Yeah. It's awakening from the dream of personhood into the reality of our infinite truth. And like you said, we can use all these stories to do that. And there's really nothing that Spirit can't use to help us in our awakening. It's really a matter of what we want. And that can be a little upsetting for a lot of us who maybe are spiritual seekers, that to hear, oh, it's just what you want, right? Because we think, oh, I want peace. Well, if you're saying I want peace, and you're sitting there feeling miserable, then some part of you is not wanting peace, right? but owning that and acknowledging that is sometimes hard, but it's really crucial, right? In our healing, because when we can say to ourselves, okay, well, I'm actually scared of peace. I'm actually, a part of me is terrified of that love. Then at least we're coming into recognition of how things are in our experience, and that is a stepping stone to then letting it go and having that opening.
It really is the answer to empower you and take that ability to, it is whatever I want to see. It is, and that radical honesty, that being completely afraid of peace. That's why I'm not, and afraid of our power to do anything, to change anything. I love how it was Caesar, right, saying how, no, you're asking people to think differently, and we don't want to think differently. We want this structure. We want it like this. This is the way we want it. And that's really what the rebellion of that ego is just saying, we want it this way. Don't question our reality. We want the laws we have. Don't make us question our reality. We want it like this. And, it's just planting those seeds that it will be breaking down. And, as much as we want to say it's going to happen in the next year, it's a reflection of my mind. I'm breaking it down. Am I ready to be the all-powerful being of all the universe, or am I still going to be, a little version of it that's battling with human standard and characteristics?
Yeah, that was a very important part, I thought, of the movie, when Pontius Pilate confronts Jesus, and Jesus actually turns it around and confronts Pontius Pilate. But the interesting thing that they left out of that was that little glib in the Bible or in the New Testament that Pilate brings in a servant with a bowl of water, and he washes his hands of the whole matter. And I was curious as to why they may have left that out of the movie itself, because that was I've all seen that as the way the ego is best represented is to create a bunch of chaos, set things into motion, and then try to wash your hands of it and deny any kind of culpability for whatever it is that you let loose upon the earth. So we do have to be very honest about, I set this situation up, I'll own it, but at the same time, I'll go through the process of forgiveness of the players and of myself and step to a higher level. So I think that one scene probably was my only real criticism of the movie in its entirety.
Yeah, and I guess that change I'm okay with, because like Pontius Pilate, he didn't really wash his hands of it, right? I mean, obviously the Bible says that, but the Romans wanted Jesus dead. It was, the Bible portrays it as somehow pinning it on the Jews. Well, that's perfect. Let's have them as a scapegoat for the next 2,000 years, But it was really the Romans who were upset by what Jesus was saying and didn't want someone threatening their power. So, at least in my mind, that rings a little truer to how things probably unfolded. But again, it's all just talking about different versions of the dream. So
Yeah. I like when he said, you're more threatening than the Iscariots. Is that what it is? And I'm no good with names. And we're talking about Yeshua, right? Anyway. This whole, all of it, it's so funny that, especially when I first saw the movie, my mind was like, oh, no, this didn't happen this way. I know the Bible says it's like this. They didn't even put the nails in his hands. Are you kidding me? All this stuff, just endless, just everything is like, and it's when you relax into it. And I saw it kind of coming up in my mind a little bit this time as well. Just, my ego just wants to make it about the form and the images and specifics and rights and wrongs almost. And even though that might be true in some realm, the need for really recognizing beyond that. And I keep saying this, I just realized this, but it's just it keeps coming back to, if I bring it into my responsibility, it's naturally purifying the mind if you're willing to see past the forms, see past the specifics. And it's just, every time watching it, it's just just let it wash away. It's pretty amazing. I mean, such a story that we have a very, very specific part of the brain that believes in God, and it's almost life or death kind of an idea. So this is like trying to break that barrier of, now it's the only one that can question your mind about your belief in God is you. And so it's like we need to shake that foundation, which is very firm. And when your idea of God is on any image or any person besides yourself, or even yourself, or any idea of it, it gets complex, then it all needs to be shaken. Or in other words, it will be shaken, because it is based off of something that is ultimately not real and doesn't have the firm foundation of literally the beginning of all existence.
Yeah, that's very true. Another little bit of minutia about the film was it was filmed in Morocco, and it was a very bare bones kind of rush production. It began in October, and it was completed on December 25th, our traditional observation of the birth of Jesus. And I also thought that was kind of a fun synchronicity about how the film came into being, was that it was, it was put together on the fly, as it were. And it somehow kind of add an additional seal to the appropriateness of this movie, because it was given birth by being completed coming out of the womb on Christmas Day. So that's another aspect of the movie that I found somewhat charming or enchanting.
Yeah, for some reason, it actually just reminds me, a number of years ago, I took a trip to Israel, and I decided I wanted to go basically over Christmas, New Year's time frame, and I flew out on the 24th of December, and I think by the time I actually landed or got into Jerusalem, I forget the timeline, but basically I was there for Christmas Day. And yeah, I don't know, there was something auspicious. It just felt like it kind of connected with what you were just sharing.
Yeah, overall, I would say it's a great movie. I think people should take the time to go see it, or to rent it and see it, I guess. I don't know. Maybe this video will cause a revival, and all of a sudden it will start appearing in theaters. Wouldn't that be fun?
I can almost guarantee that'll happen.
I actually watched it on YouTube, so the whole thing is there. You look up "Watch the Last Temptation of Christ" movies online free. That's the title of it.
And so how much did that cost you?
Free.
Well, see, that's another part of the illusion. Every time you think it's free, somehow you're being seduced. Somehow there is an apple that you're about to eat that's going to show up in your life.
2 hours and 60 minutes and 22 seconds. That's what it cost me.
Mm.
It was a long movie.
Yeah, for me it was an easy ride. I never really noticed the time because I was so engaged with it and fascinated by the costuming and just all of the fine points in the movie. I thought was really amazing. So it will suck you in and cause you to think about, am I really being called upon to sacrifice? What is the sacrifice? Well, the sacrifice is something we hold very dear, but it always ends up at the end of the day causing us to fall deeper into the dream, and we label that death. But death is not the final scene in our movie or in that movie.
As far as for the movie, I definitely highly recommend anybody on any sort of spiritual path at all, really want to engage it, really want to embrace it. This movie is just so beautiful in portraying, just having a different way of looking at the story of Jesus, and that really, just starts that questioning. It starts that really, going within and asking yourself, well, now what really did happen? What really happened? And that's the key there, is going to the Holy Spirit within yourself instead of trusting any book, any version of the story at all, really questioning it for yourself. Like this whole story of Adam and Eve, for an example, and they weren't even physical bodies until after they took of this knowledge of good and evil, and yet it's portrayed as physical bodies already, and so it gets a little more complex when we get into the actual comprehension of the spiritual universe. And so I really highly recommend that you take it as if it is real, and then go on your own, with the stories that you have of your own mind, of what happened with Jesus, and just not necessarily compare or pick or choose, but just question with the Holy Spirit, and let yourself be taught, and let yourself teach what you would learn.
And I think that all sounds good, since we're giving our rating of the movie. Of the movies we've watched before, this is my least favorite. I give this movie a solid meh. I think there were some things you could get out of it, and some real gems within it, but overall, I thought, I don't know, I didn't really connect with the Jesus of this movie. But I did want to mention again that this is part of a series for people listening on ACIM Gather. We have been doing these about once every 2 weeks or so. I think this is the 4th movie that we've seen, and I think it's called Miracles at the Movies. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, it's Finding Miracles at the Movies. It's on YouTube on One Feather, my channel on YouTube, and it's spelled in a very phonetic way. It's WONEFEATHER on YouTube, and you can see a whole bunch of different things. ACIM Fireside Chats that Devan and I do. Barret, I do The Miracle Within. Stephen and I do ACIM Hangouts, and I don't know, there's just all kinds of stuff happening there, so check it out.
All right, thanks for putting this together, Devan, and thanks for doing the Facebook, YouTube side of it, Chris. It's been a really good talk, as always.
Yes, and we'll convene in about 2 weeks with another movie that's going to be even better than this one for Barret.
Hopefully.
Do we have an idea of what that movie is?
Not yet, but
okay. Thank you.
We will reveal that to the world and to ourselves. So anyway, I'm going to hit the stop broadcast button. Everybody have a great day, and I'll be chatting with you soon.